we say we are free. What is freedom, we say? Freedom to do what we want to do. But stop a minute and think. What makes you want to do what you want to do? And you might come to realize then that our very wants and our very desires have been what? Induced. So that the things we really want and the things we really desire are those things that maintain the system and are those things that destroy us as a people. But yet we object to anyone speaking about it because we see our indulging in them as some expression of our what? Freedom. Yet in this system, when you so-called let a people free, and yet you must maintain them in subordination, they must then, with their freedom of choice, always choose what? The wrong thing. But you give them a foolish pride into thinking that since they have choice, they are therefore free. A very slick system. It induces the captive African to behave in such a way such that he will economically and otherwise and apparently of his own accord support the European establishment to the detriment of his own without being conscious of his doing so. Why should a black person be made to feel ugly? What is the function of associating blackness and ugliness, blackness and uncleanliness, blackness and unlovableness, of being unlovable? Is it just purely a racist attitude of some evil people? What do you do when you feel ugly or unkempt? But you do something else beside that. You go out and you buy yourself a new, you go out and spend a lot of money. But what's happening here? Who do you spend it with? Who gets the bulk of the money that's spent? In other words, the African feeling ugly and unclean in his attempt to compensate for that feeling of ugliness and uncleanliness goes to the very person who made him feel that way in the beginning and purchases and buys from that person and therefore maintains the very individual to destroy the self-image to start with. Do you think then an economic system that depends upon a bunch of people trying to compensate for feelings of inferiority by buying brand names? I don't know where brands, you know. By buying names of other people on their clothing? Do you think that system is ever really going to let you out of that feeling of ugliness? It can't. It's economically dependent upon that feeling, ladies and gentlemen. If we were made to feel naturally beautiful, don't you know we would destroy the cosmetics and industry? So we must feel naturally that nature itself has not made us beautiful, so that we must compensate for it. And therefore we can see then that the inducement of inferiority in black people, the inducement of a feeling of ugliness, the inducement of these various negative feelings must stay in black people, so that in trying to compensate for these feelings, black people will economically, politically, and otherwise support the very people that induced them. You see, the alienation of black people is economically functional. It's just not a feeling you have in your mind. The fact that you may wrestle with your own self-estrangement, separation from yourself, is not just a feeling you're having within yourself. It is a politically functional feeling. It is induced for political purposes. What does it mean to be alienated? To be alienated does not only mean that one suffers a split within the personality, that one feels estranged from himself, that one does not know himself, Certainly that's an aspect of alienation, and this is the way it's talked about in the psychology books, you see. And when you read all of this psychology, you think you're really getting heavy, you see, and the Eurocentrics teach it to you very directly, and you feel very profound when you talk about the great dynamics of the head and ego struggling with one another. Why do you alienate a person? We are alienated so that we can serve aliens. That is the function of alienation. Alienation means to be determined by forces outside oneself, other than oneself, to the enhancement of those aliens. When Marx talks about alienation, then do not just cue in on the alienation that the worker feels. Recognize that the worker has to be alienated in order to serve the owner of the means of production. That's its ultimate function. You will recognize then, an alienated people can only spend money with aliens. They can only support aliens. They can sit here and support these Koreans and these Arabs and these Indians and everybody else but a black person. They can support everybody's families but their own. They can give jobs to these people's uncles and aunts and sisters and brothers and children, but they cannot give jobs to their own children. They can feel good when they give all of their money to Bloomingdale's and these other places, but they feel cheated every time they trade with the black person. You have to be alienated for that reason. That's why we alienate. And do you think the white man intends to turn that feeling of alienation loose in your heart? You are dead wrong. No matter how often you go into a boardroom, no matter how high you move up into the white hierarchy, because alienation is functional for white power and functional for white economic, social, and political dominance. And yet I see somebody expressing surprise after 40 years that black children still have a sense of inferiority because you don't know your black psychology and because you studied them from a Eurocentric psychological point of view. And because you saw your goal as not removing the white man from power, but of sleeping with them in these beds and not questioning the evilness of his system, but of wanting to share in it. We never had a national debate. Who gave the NAACP the permission to go out to court and talk for black people in terms of equality? Equality with whom? We should have debated that. That's a moral issue. Equality with the slave master? Equality with exploiters? Equality with people who, every time they stepped on a continent, destroyed and degraded the people that they dealt with? Is this what we want, a sharing of the spoils? Or is it that we want a whole different world than what these people have bought on this earth today? But we were diverted from asking that fundamental question. We were made to think simply because we were getting paid less than white folk, our problem would be solved merely by getting equal pay. But the problem is much deeper than that, ladies and gentlemen. But that too is a part of the illness, you see. So then the maladjustment is used and is induced in the African to engage in self-destructive behavior so that he may annihilate himself, or that his demise can be permitted or enacted without triggering Eurocentric guilt and without costly resistance. It was induced to permit the European to perceive himself as naturally superior, to protect the European from genetic annihilation. And while I'm on that subject, let me just mention one quick thing here about genetic annihilation. Some of you saw this, I'm sure. U.S. News and World Report, June 22nd, 1987. What does it say here? Are we having enough babies? You know whose question that could be. Of course, this is a piece done by Ben Wattenberg. Some of you might have seen him at various places, and he's doing a very interesting thing now. He wrote a book called The Birth Dearth, indicating, of course, that not enough white people are being produced in the world. And So he starts here, what's happening today has never happened before. It will dramatically change the U.S. and the world in which we live. Over the years, I've heard businessmen, diplomats, government planners, and parents all begging for the same thing. No surprises, please. This book, a speculation about the future based on current trends, is an attempt to deal with that plaint. Forewarned is forearmed. What is happening is this. For about a decade and a half, the peoples of the free, modern, industrial world, that includes the U.S., have not born enough children to reproduce themselves over an extended period of time. We had a baby boom. Now there is a birth dearth. I believe that the birth dearth will, in the near future, begin to cause turbulence at every level of our economy. I believe, too, that the birth dearth will leave in its wake tens of millions of unhappy adults who will end up with no children at all, or fewer children than they really wanted, or no grandchildren, or fewer grandchildren than they had hoped for. I believe the demographic and immigration patterns inherent in the birth dearth will yield an even smaller proportion of Americans of white European stock. And this will likely cause more ethnic and racial tension and turmoil than otherwise would occur. That's what you see. People concerned with what? Their genes, maintaining their ethnicity, seeing it as an important factor, not trying to obliterate it the way we and our assimilationist people have tried to do, not trying to forget who they are, but trying to hold on to their identity. This is one of the challenges of Afrocentric education, by the way. And one of the things that we have to look at, what would happen if these Europeans begin to disappear from the face of the earth? What will happen if they decide that they are not going to disappear and want to make some other people disappear? How are they going to deal with their low birth rate? What are the political implications about that situation? It has very serious implications for African people. And these people are now getting ready to deal with it. I believe further, he says, that the birth dearth may well turn out to be of great harm to the broadest value we treasure. It will make it difficult to promote and defend liberty in Western nations and the rest of the modernized world. Talking about white folk, certainly couldn't be talking about us in terms of liberty. Primacy and prosperity. And he's talking about here, we live in a community of free and modern nations banded together in a loose but real alliance. These nations like to argue. They argue about strategic defense, about who will buy cars from whom, and about whose wine shall be subject to what countervailing duties. But beneath the bickering, something remarkable has happened during the last four decades. This community of free modern nations has shaped and molded the nature of the entire world. A direct admission of their role in the world, you see. We've shaped and what? Created the world. Now that is being what? Threatened. And what are we going to do about maintaining it? You think that these people are going to let you free? You've got another thought coming. Economically, technologically, culturally, geopolitically, and in many ways militarily as well. In other words, we've shaped it militarily as well. It's interesting sometimes when I see the Europeans talk about their boys being killed, and of course I was being killed along with them. They talk about gets being robbed and others being robbed. But remember one thing, if you're